I always get a little sad when I see an otherwise good photo with halos. And that's because halos are just ugly. But what is a halo? Well, halos are those things in your photo when you have a transition area between a very dark area and a very light area, and for some reason or other, the edge on the either light side or the dark side looks a little bit darker, and this looks just very unnatural. You don't want this in your photo, and introducing halos is one of the most common beginner mistakes. So in this video, I'm going to give you 5 simple tips to avoid halos in your photography. First tip is very simple. It's just sharpen less. It's very easy to over sharpen your photos, but over sharpening can introduce many different kinds of artifacts, including halos. And the thing is, our brains get very used to sharpening. So if you sharpen a little bit, you'll get used to it, and then maybe you'll want to sharpen a little bit more. That's usually a mistake. So if you have a halo in your photo, it might be because you've just sharpened too much. So decrease that sharpening and the halo is probably going to go away. Radius. Now, a lot of sharpening tools, not all of them, but a lot of them have a radius slider. Well, this radius slider basically does this. If you increase it, you increase the coarseness of the sharpening, or the prominence of the sharpening as the photo is viewed at smaller sizes. And it's tempting, again, to increase the radius slider because it sometimes gives your photo a little bit of a pop. But increasing the radius slider is one of the easiest ways to introduce halos in your photo. Yeah, you don't want to increase that radius too much. And here's a hint. If you want that sort of effect of boosting a little bit of local contrast, increasing the radius using a sharpening tool is probably not the right tool for the job. My favorite tip is this tip. It's sharpen locally. And this is something I do in all my photos because pretty much all my photos have a subject which is in focus, a bird, and a background which is out of focus. Maybe not all of them, but most of them have that. And I always just sharpen the subject locally. And I do so like this with a very gentle mask that falls off towards the edges. And I do this for 2 reasons, actually. It's not just to avoid halos, but it helps to avoid halos because if you sharpen with a fall off towards the edge actually isn't receiving any sharpening. So that edge isn't going to have any halos, right? But also, if you sharpen with a gradual fall off towards the edges, you're going to get a more natural effect because in real life, when you look at an object like a bird, which is like a ball, you naturally perceive less detail towards the edges. So that sharpening effect goes with that natural perception. So sharpening locally is one of the best ways to avoid halos. And here's another thing. Even in photos like landscape photos, when more or everything is in focus or is acceptably sharp, you might still want to sharpen locally because if you want the viewer to perceive your photo as sharp, you actually just want to sharpen key parts of the photo to give that extra perception of sharpness. Sometimes that will actually make your photo look more sharp than if you sharpen the whole thing. For example, if you have a landscape photo with a foreground and distant mountains, you probably want to apply a little bit more sharpening close to the foreground and a little less sharpening towards the background and the mountains. We perceive less detail in real life. As the distance increases, you want to keep that in your photo. Follow that sort of, again, that perceptual feeling, and that will make your photo feel a lot more natural. There's another reason why halos appear in a lot of photos, and I don't want to mention this one because a lot of people like to do this, but these halos come from boosting shadows too much. Now, we see this a lot on the internet, especially with the HDR look, and I get it. If you boost the shadows, add a lot of saturation, you might attract a little bit of extra initial attention because it kind of looks like sort of like a Halloween costume or something. No, there's nothing wrong with boosting shadows in your photo. And in fact, boosting shadows can help draw the viewer's eye. But you only want to do that enough so that the viewer can piece together the sense of the scene. You don't necessarily want to hit the viewer in the head with your entire photo and render them unconscious with a splash of lifted shadows and color. You just want to do it enough to give the viewer a sense of the scene. And actually, if your scene has a lot of darker areas and some very bright area like a sky, that contrast is actually nice. You don't want to fight that light and render it as if everything were uniformly lit. You just want to lift shadows enough to sort of give the sense as if the viewer were there and perceiving the scene and adjusting their eye a little bit to the shadow area versus the light area. It takes a lot less shadow recovery than you think to do that. And as a bonus, if you lift shadows less, then you're going to have less halos, because if you aggressively lift shadows, it's inevitably going to result in some strange artifacts near the border between the dark areas and the light areas. Final tip I have is turn your edits on and off. Again, when you're editing a photo, sometimes your brain will adjust by itself to make the photo look more natural, even though your edits might be very unnatural. The best way to counter this is to periodically turn your edits on and off. For example, here's a photo where I've introduced some halos by boosting the sharpening too much. Let's turn it on and off. Here is off, and here is on. Do you see how easy it is to recognize the halos in this shot? You do the same with your edits. Every time you're editing, and this doesn't just apply to detecting halos, it applies to detecting any kind of over-editing or strange editing. Simply go back to the beginning, turn your edits on and off, and you'll see whether you've gone too far. So that's it. Those are my tips for reducing halos in your photography. I hope you liked this video, but if you didn't, you might be an Instagrammer.